Hello, everyone. I'm Jacob Beranek. I'm the composer in residence with the Midsummer's Music Festival of Door County, Wisconsin. I'm happy to be with you today as part of a coffee talk, Midsummer's annual lecture series. This is my third annual coffee talk, and it's an honor to be with you all, even though it is through a computer. I look forward to the next time that we can all discuss music together in person and listen to music together in person. Today, what I'd like to talk about is a composer who I'm particularly fond of, Bohuslav Martinu. He's a Czech composer who lived in America for several years in the 1940s and 50s. And I'm particularly passionate about his music and had the opportunity to study some of his writings this year, which gave me a greater appreciation for the man and his music. I'm calling this presentation Bohuslav Martinu, Revisiting and Revising. And that is simply because I think many people still do not know much about Martinu. And what they do know, it's not from music history textbooks, it's gleaned here and there. And so I want to revisit Martinu and perhaps share some tidbits that you all had not heard before. But I'd also like to revive an interest in his music and who he was, and just talk a little bit more about the personality and the philosophy of this composer. So I hope you enjoy this discussion. I'd like to say right off the bat too, usually we have some robust discussion while this is all going on, and of course that is not possible through the computer right now. However, if you want to leave any questions or comments in the comments section, I'll be happy to take a look at those and respond to you. And I'd also like to say that if you would like to email me, you can contact me through Midsummer's and they will put us in touch. So I look forward to hearing any thoughts from viewers about this talk. Now, let's dig in. So I mentioned that I had the opportunity to research Martinu more than usual lately. I'm beginning my senior year at Vanderbilt University, and as part of our junior year as composition majors, and we're required to write a junior thesis on a topic of our choosing, and I chose Martinu. Recently, his diaries were translated into English for the first time, and we have the scholar Tomáš Svátoš to thank for that. And with this new groundbreaking translation, I was able to read Martinu's thoughts on his creative process, thoughts on music in general, music education, and musical analysis. And this really changed my perspective on his music as well as my own. My junior thesis really had to do with this idea of Martinu being popular in his own time, but neglected since then, and questioning why that is. To give you a sense of how popular he was, there's a quote I have here. I believe this was David Diamond, the composer, relaying this story. Bohuslav Martinu so overshadowed his New York City neighbor, Béla Bartók, that Martinu once confessed, I feel very, very unhappy that I'm having such a big success in America. Mrs. Bartók is very unhappy that Béla's music is completely ignored and my music is played all the time. Can you imagine that? Bohuslav Martinu overshadowing Béla Bartók. And they did live in New York at the same time. Of course, musicians today know the name of Bartók much more than they do the name of Martinu. So never before has a composer been so popular in his own time and then so thoroughly articulate a musical language in his writing, to be so thoroughly neglected by musical academia of the time. I really don't know of any other composer that this is the case for. Martinu wrote in depth and extensively about his artistic process, and as I mentioned, a new form of musical analysis. So half of my thesis was really dealing with this side of Martinu and turning his own thoughts, not against him, but for lack of a better phrase, yes, I was taking him at his word. Again, to my knowledge, I don't believe any scholar has ever taken Martinu's thoughts on composition and applied them to Martinu's own music. And for me, this was, the natural progression that that if you have a composer who's talking about how he views music and how he thinks it should be analyzed, well, then you should test his music first and foremost and see how it stands up, and then start looking at other pieces of music. So I analyzed a movement of his Second Symphony just to get the ball rolling and in my own little way. And I hope other scholars do take up this really untapped goldmine for theory and perhaps a new form of analysis. The other half of my thesis had to do with Martinu's, probably the chief principle of his philosophy, which was that great music is organic. And he wasn't talking pesticides here. This idea that music is inevitable. Great music is inevitable, and in order to be inevitable, it needs to be natural. And that's a hard concept to wrap one's head around when so many people think of music as, well, a score, or at the very least, an object. It's a thing. And Martinu did not. He thought of music as an action, as alive, as a process. And this philosophy really stems from this distinction. Music for him was a verb, was alive. It was not any form of dead, old product that musicians dust off and bring to life. It was something completely separate from that. And so he had this relationship with music in which he believed that there were certain ways for composers to write music that was more natural, more inevitable than others. And I'll spare you all the heady philosophical details. But this thought was pretty unorthodox. Well, it's unorthodox now, but it was certainly unorthodox in the 1940s and 50s when serialism was the musical compositional method in vogue. And a quick synopsis of serialism, it's basically the idea that one should write music with a prefabricated set of rules before they even begin writing. You organize what notes are going to occur in what order, and even later on it became what is known as total serialism, when dynamics and articulations were controlled by a matrix. It was all mathematically prepared ahead of time, and Martinu couldn't have been farther from that. So academia really did not look fondly upon his music in this time, even though his music was very popular with the public. So it's an interesting divide there that I think had a lot to do with why he was forgotten so quickly, and his music is just now being revived. What really makes him unique, though, is the combination of these two attitudes. And because he was so unorthodox and really kind of a foil to all that was common in musical composition for that era, I would argue he's absolutely essential for a complete understanding of 20th century music, because he was such a unique figure. His music is so unique, and one really can't understand the environment that these academic composers were writing in America in the 1950s if you don't consider the music of Bohuslav Martinu, which was so different from them. So this presentation will follow this general outline that I want to give some background on Martinu and help viewers understand a little bit more about the man and his priorities and how he thought about music. Then I would like to get into some more what really made Martinu unique and kind of go step by step and explain how he was unlike any other composer of this time. Then, of course, I'd like to talk a little bit about his influence on me, because it has been profound, especially this last year. And then I'd like to end with some listening suggestions. If you haven't heard Martinu's music before or are unsure about it still, I have a few pieces that I think, well, it might win you over. So let's talk about Martinu's life. He was born in 1890 in, I like this, the Svati Jakub Church in Polička, which is a town right in the southeastern part of Bohemia, which is in the present-day Czech Republic. His father was a watchman, and that's why he was born in Church Tower. Now, he eventually took up the violin and was sent to Prague to study, but he didn't really get along well at the Prague Conservatory. He realized pretty quickly that his passion lay in composition, and he did not get along with the violin faculty there, and he was expelled for incorrigible negligence, i.e. he didn't practice that much. He had some interesting experiences early on in his life, and I'll just share two of them, just to give you a sense of perhaps a unique experience in his early 20s that shaped who he became as a composer. One was while he was still at Prague Conservatory, he was in an ear training class, and they were doing an exercise where the teacher plays a musical phrase, and the students are required to write it down note for note, real time. It's called dictation. In one dictation, he writes, "I stopped following the notes consciously. I became lost in thought after the fourth note, but continued even though I knew I was lost just so I could finish the dictation. This means that I lost control of myself, that I was working without conscious involvement, or with an open mind. What resulted was a flawless dictation, and it was the only such one in class." And then he adds, "You can imagine my surprise." The other anecdote here has to do with a similar kind of subconscious experience with music, but this was while he was composing. He was 20 years old at the time, actually 19, I believe. He was writing a piece called Toilers of the Sea for orchestra. I was extremely surprised while I was writing it. It was the first time in my life that I had conceived a work completely finished. I was astonished with what intensity and definitiveness it came out on paper under my hands. This is something that's probably called inspiration, i.e., that very open mind of which I was still capable as a young man, where I did not refrain myself intellectually. I must admit that it had never happened again to me with such intensity. So the two things I'd like to point out from these anecdotes is that Martinu, from an early age, understood that there was an aspect of musical composition, of music making, of musical perception, that was subconscious, at least for him. This became a cornerstone of his compositional philosophy, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So I just wanted to prime the pump with those couple examples. He had these very, very unique experiences that affected how he understood music, affected his relationship with music. Eventually moved to Paris in the 1920s. Here's a description from him of what he was doing in France. "What I went looking for in France was not Debussy, Impressionism, or musical expression, but the actual foundations upon which Western culture lies, which, in my opinion, reflect Czech national character much more than a labyrinth of mysteries and problems. Czech elements I brought to France were not destroyed. Instead, they were enhanced." What he was talking about here is that a lot of people felt he got Frenchified, that he went to France and he quit being Czech, and instead he became French. And, well, he really believed quite the contrary, that going to France helped him be more Czech. See, at the time, Martinu said that the Czechs were slaves to German metaphysics. Basically, he just didn't like how philosophical music composition was getting in the Czech lands at this time. He felt that the Czech people were a straightforward people. They weren't an overtly emotional people. That they were just more staunch and less prone to extremes. And he felt composition was moving away from those national characteristics, and so he wanted to reinforce those. And that's why he went to France, because he felt there was a kinship there in understanding music. Of course, Czech academia saw him as a traitor, and that earned him a blacklist status pretty much for the rest of his life, as the academicians that were in power at this time eventually rose to government power under the communist regime, and they made sure Martinu's music was all but struck from public eye. But for Martinu, Czech music was a way of thinking. It wasn't like a lot of people would say, a certain dance rhythm or a folk song. It was a quality of music. It was straightforward. It was concrete. It didn't mess around. It wasn't too ooey gooey. He wanted to get to the point, and that's what he felt made his music Czech, not any quotations of folk songs or folk rhythms. While he was in Paris, he studied with a man named Albert Roussel, who was a traditionalist. He was, I think, called the French Brahms, which was a kind of a stark contrast to what was going on in Paris at this time. Absurdism, Dadaism, constructivism, dynamism, all these isms, but they weren't traditional by any means. And Martinu had his fair share of experimenting while he was in Paris during the 1920s, but eventually the tradition won out. And the majority of his mature music can be categorized as neoclassical, a resurgence of classical principles in modern music. And this had a lot to do, I think, with those sensibilities that he felt Czech music and Czech character embodied. Of course, we all know that the state of Europe devolved quite significantly in the 1930s and 40s. And with the rise of the Nazis and the fall of Czechoslovakia, Bohuslav Martinu was a man without a home. He was not allowed to return to his native land ever. And he only narrowly escaped the Nazis in France in 1941. He missed them by hours. He had moved from Paris to a different town, and they literally broke down his door within hours of when he left for America. Now, his passage to America and how he got set up there was smoothed largely in part to the work of Serge Koussevitzky. Koussevitzky was the conductor of the Boston Symphony and was a very influential figure in American music at the time. He happened to be a fan of Martinu's music and gave several premieres. And they met in Paris in the 20s, actually. Martinu saw him at a cafe, and he just walked up and introduced himself, and later gave him a score, a piece of music he had written, and Koussevitzky premiered it with the Boston Symphony. And from then on, the two had a very close friendship. You can see in the picture here, Martinu and Koussevitzky, who is standing, and in the background, Nadia Boulanger, the famed pedagogue, is also making a cameo appearance. Kind of a neat photograph to let you know what kind of company Martinu was in at this time. As I said before, he enjoyed a significant popularity. There's another story that kind of reinforces this. He was on the commuter train back to New York from Boston after a premiere with Koussevitzky, I believe. And the people on the commuter train heading to work recognized Martinu from his photo in the paper, and they gave him a standing ovation. Can you imagine that on a commuter train? There's people heading to work at who knows where, an office building, and yet here was this classical composer who was so well revered that the people on the train gave him a standing ovation. It's incredible. Again, you wouldn't think it with how well he's known today. Martinu also taught at several leading institutions in America. He taught at Curtis in Philadelphia. He taught at Mannes in New York. He taught at Tanglewood, which was Boston University's summer program. He taught alongside Aaron Copland. And he also held a faculty position at Princeton. I like to tell a little story about when he accepted the position at Princeton. He was given a tour by the faculty members there. This gives you a little idea of what an oddball Martinu could be at times. The story goes that Martinu was given an entire tour of Princeton, and he didn't say a single word the entire time. One can imagine it's probably upwards of an hour that he was spent in the company of his soon-to-be colleagues, and he didn't say a single word, not one, until the tour was over, and they were all kind of staring at him, expecting some sort of response, and he said one word, Martini. Now, these were a bunch of academic theorists, and their minds all apparently jumped to the 18th century composer Martini. And they tried to ask him what he was referring to, and then it dawned on one of them that what he really wanted was a drink. And so they went to a restaurant and all ordered martinis, and then Martinu talked. But can you imagine that? Such a famous composer and meeting such important people and not saying a word until the end. Martini. Kind of funny. At this point in Martinu's compositional career, he had moved from his standard neoclassicism into a phase that Dr. Svatos, the translator that I had mentioned, translated Martinu's writings. Svatos calls this the American lyricism period, which I like a lot. It's Martinu's most lyrical phase of composition, standardly speaking. And it was from about 1942 to 1946. He wrote several of his symphonies during this time period. And it is really a beautiful, beautiful addition to the classical music repertoire. I'm going to talk about that now in the next slide. But just to close out Martinu's life, he finally returned to Europe in 1953. However, he never made it back to Czechoslovakia, and he died in 1959 in Switzerland. Now, more about his music. His music is really it's something else, because Martinu so prioritized natural flow and this idea of cohesive inner order and emotional communication that it created a product, a type of music that was unlike anything else that was being written at the time. Now that's a lot of big heady words that I just threw around, but all that's to say, I think one can describe Martinu's music as flowing well. It really was a kind of music that was a synthesis. There was no distinction between this element and that element and the other. It was just music that came out and was kind of a continuum, a conglomeration of different elements. But the very fact that he prioritized music being natural separated him from, like I mentioned earlier, the serialists. So that takes out a large portion of American music at the time. Martinu was also not one to be hyper emotional. He didn't have any soaring musical moments. He hated climaxes in music. And he also, on the flip side, was not one to be very intellectual. So that separates him from you could say, the American school of formalist composers like Walter Piston, perhaps. But this disinclination towards romanticism also separated him from the romantics like Howard Hanson, for example. So there's another set of American composers that he was just different from. Now, the two most striking things about his music was that he treated music as its own pure medium. He was not one to make statements, political, nationalist, philosophical even. Music was music for him, and he didn't, I think he would say, wanted to be tainted with extra musical ideas. So this really distanced him from composers like Bernstein, for example, or even Aaron Copland. Now we're whittling it down pretty much. I think the only composer that I can think of that really fits all the criteria I've mentioned so far would be Bartók. But unlike Bartók, Martinu really didn't work with themes. There really aren't catchy melodies. And I know for a great majority of Bartók's life, he was not focused on melodies either. But while Bartók was living in America in the 1940s, a lot of his music has to do with themes, thematic development and material. And Martinu really eschewed thematic development. All his music was based on little motivic fragments that he just spun out in what he felt was a natural and inevitable way. And so I think when you narrow it down like that, you begin to see that Martinu really was kind of in a class of his own, and his music sounds like it. I'm going to include one quote here, which is one of the most endearing things I can think of a composer ever saying. This is Martinu talking about his second symphony in the program notes, which, by the way, he hated writing program notes because he didn't think there was any need for them. He just wanted music to speak for itself. He said that over and over, my music is a whole, and I want it to be evaluated as such. He didn't want analysis. He didn't want program notes. But this is what he said in his program notes. No sincere musician will make it his ideal to destroy the nerves of his listeners. My second symphony is the case in point. It's calm and lyric. It seems to me that we have no need of a professional and technical expression of torture. Rather, do we need orderly thought, calmly expressed? For me, not as a composer, but if I were an audience member and I missed all the dissonant music of the time, a composer felt the need to tell me, don't fear, I don't want to torture you. I want to just give you orderly thought, calmly expressed. I would feel so grateful. I would feel at ease. I would trust this composer, and I would look forward to what calm, lyrical, orderly music I was about to hear, especially amidst the atrocities of World War II, which was in full swing at this time. Martinu believed in beauty and calm and order, and that certainly put him in a category of his own in a lot of ways. Now, to touch a little bit more about his compositional philosophy before I talk about how this influenced me, there's a few points I would just like to drive home. One from the previous slide is that Martinu really believed his music should be viewed as a whole, as a unit. He believed all music should be seen that way, that it shouldn't be analyzed from a theoretical perspective on the score, that he wanted music to speak to the listeners directly, in person, and as a whole, that he didn't want people to take it apart. He wanted people to enjoy their listening experience and then have the quality of his music be evaluated on how that music as a whole communicated to his listeners. He also believed that music was alive when it had organic inner order, which we discussed before, means a sort of inevitable flow in the composition, which he enumerated all sorts of various and sundry ways a composer could make that happen, but that's a discussion for another time. What I will say that allowed him to think that music could be organic and flow naturally was his strong conviction that music came from a subconscious creative process. That the whole that I said was so important to him really took shape before the composer consciously realized it. That there was this thinking that went on in the composer's subconscious mind or metaconscious mind, but whatever you want to call it, it was not conscious. And because the composer could have this feeling for the whole before the composer put a note on paper, that's what allowed natural relationships to arise in the music. Again, that's one certainly unorthodox idea, but one that I find very appealing. Another thing that he was adamant about is that composers should not force ideas onto the page. That is to say, you shouldn't think up musical material to fit a certain form. You should let the musical material dictate the form. You should let the musical material lead the composition process. Again, not something that was being taught at this time. He would say that composers run into writer's block when they lose track of the whole of the composition and they start trying to come up with this to fit here, this to fit here, this to fit here. He'd say there's no quicker way to shut down composition of a piece than to think of it like that, to think up stuff. Rather, the composer should back off and let the music lead. Now, how this was achieved, he would say, is through craftsmanship. Another word that you don't hear that much anymore. Craftsmanship for him was, one, there is a quote where he said, craftsmanship means a love for one's profession, which I think is nice. He loved what he did. But he would also say, craftsmanship is knowing your tools as a composer and how to allow things to flow naturally. And this allows for healthy emotional expression in music. Not overblown emotionalism and not nil. It was just the right amount. And that's how he'd like to think of it. This also allowed him control of musical line and musical energy, which I would say is the real way one can get at a piece that sounds like it's meant to flow that way, that it just works. Now, what does that mean for my composition? Trying to make it a little more concrete now instead of these abstractions. My approach has been to take a lot of what Martinu said to heart. I do believe there is a subconscious creative process that happens before you physically put notes to paper. And I use that time to listen to other pieces of music that I might like to rub off on me. So that's how I begin my creative process. Afterwards, though, eventually there's some point of inspiration when a motif or a melody hits me or suggests itself, to use his terminology. And this is the point where I've tried to train my brain to listen to that little musical fragment that pops into my mind. Instead of saying, "Oh, quick, let me write that down and see how I can jam this into some sort of pre-existing form," I instead ponder, what does that melody want to do? Is it happy? Is it sad? Is it upbeat? What's the energy? What's the flow of it? Then I write it down pretty quickly in short score, which is a way to say you don't have every instrument on its own line. You can see here actually the top picture is a fragment from the sketch of my piano trio, which Midsummer's will be premiering this year. And I was writing out, there's two separate lines on one staff, and I was trying to get a sense of the musical line. Below it is a sketch from Martinu's Second Symphony. And there again, you can see that he's trying to get the musical line down, the direction, as quickly as possible. It's like taking dictation from yourself. If you remember that example I said about how he was in school and suddenly things just flowed naturally for him. I think that's what he was trying to get at with his composition process. Of course, a lot of times the composer has to look back on what was just scribbled out frantically, feverishly, almost improvisatorily, and the composer has to revise. And again, this is where craftsmanship, I would say for me, comes in. The composer has to learn, really, does that work? Does that not work? And the composer will have tools at their disposal to understand how to make it flow more naturally. Now, for a real direct engagement with these ideas, and for all of those who are listening from the Midsummer's fan base, I'd like to give you all a little sneak peek of my piano trio, which Midsummer's will be premiering virtually this year. We won't be able to have it in person, but in a few weeks, the date is still forthcoming, Midsummer's will release a performance of it that will have been recorded live on Facebook. Now, for those of you who have not heard of Midsummer's before, I would encourage you to like their Facebook page and, well, take a listen to my music, but become familiar with them. And in any case, regarding this coffee talk, I think this snippet of music, it's about 4 minutes that I'll play electronically, of course, it hasn't been recorded yet, might serve as perhaps a way of putting Martinu's ideas through me into music, and you can see how it lines up with what we've discussed so far. So a little bit about this piece of music. It's written for violin, cello, and piano. It was composed in April and May, but it took about a month to compose. Although I can say, if we're talking about subconscious inspiration and all that, the exact date of inspiration was November 28th, 2019. I had an impulse of how I wanted the piece to go. I had a melody that came to mind, and I wrote it down as fast as I could. And that was on November 28th. I let it sit for a while, though, of course, and then picked it up in earnest in April. The final piece is 22 minutes. I'll play 4 minutes, like I said. It's in 3 movements. This snippet is from the first movement. Starts about halfway through and plays till the end. So there it is. There's some real and recent product of inspiration from Martinu's compositional philosophy, as filtered through yours truly. So for the Midsummers folks, I look forward to sharing that whole piece with you soon, and I look forward to your reactions to it as a whole, as Martinu would like us to say. Now, in somewhat a form of conclusion, I'd like to just touch back on Martinu's music as I put mine before him. And really, like I said, I want to encourage those of you who have perhaps only heard a little bit of Martinu's music or have not heard it at all to explore further. And these are my 3 recommendations for 3 pieces that are excellent Martinu starters. The 3rd Cello Sonata, recorded by Stephen Isserlis and Ali Mustonen. It's an excellent piece of music and an excellent recording. One of my favorite pieces of music of all time. And the 2nd Symphony, which I studied in my thesis, I have to recommend as well. Paavo Järvi and the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra certainly do a fantastic job with that piece. And then I also want to recommend his Nonet No. 2. I believe Midsummer's has performed this previously. I think this is a tremendously joyful, brilliant composition. He wrote it just a few months before he died, and it really is an extraordinary piece of music, bringing together 9 separate instruments, kind of a little orchestra. And there, the Sinfonia Lati Chamber Ensemble is the recording that I like of that. So please check those out. And again, write me with your thoughts. I love any opportunity to talk about Martinu. With that, I'll conclude the Martinu portion of this talk, but I'm gonna tack on a little addendum again for the Midsummers folks that are curious in what I've been up to lately. Every summer when I'm in residence, several people ask me, well, what have you been up to since we saw you last? And so in these coffee talks, I have a habit of doing a quick little overview of what has been happening in my musical life since last summer. I've written 8 pieces, including the piano trio, which you all just heard a sneak peek to. The largest of which was the Pilgrimage Overture. I wrote for full symphony orchestra. It's about 10.5 minutes. That was quite an undertaking. I'm very proud of that piece of music, though. I also, you can see here, have written a few small chamber pieces. Did another orchestra piece, a polka and scherzo, which is sheer musical fun, I think. Not as serious as the Pilgrimage Overture. Then in the bottom left, you'll see a Kammer Sinfonietta, which just means a little chamber symphony. I wrote that to be premiered in Berlin in May, but unfortunately that was postponed. Hopefully, though, it will receive its premiere this coming May. And then there's the piano trio, and if you remember last year, Midsummer's played a string quartet of mine called Of a Fleeting Flower. I arranged that for string orchestra, and it may be premiered this coming year. We'll see how things play out, and I'll be sure to let you all know who premieres that and any details there. Also, recently, I'm working on a piece for English horn and piano. That's my project right now. Had a couple performances since Midsummer's last summer, 2 that I really want to mention. One had the honor to be performed by the Oxford University Wind Orchestra. Excuse me. They performed my piece Památník, which is the Czech word for memorial. I wrote the piece for the 100th anniversary of Czechoslovakian independence back in 2018. And it was performed on this occasion for the 30th anniversary of the fall of communism in Czechoslovakia. And so I was honored to be part of that celebration at Oxford.